Welcome back, darlings, and if you are new here, you have found us at exactly the right moment. Drop where you are watching from in the comments. It means more than you know. And if a story has ever made you forget to breathe, subscribe. We are just getting started. Chapter 1. She had struck a lord of the realm with a fireplace poker. And the only thing Agnes Holt regretted was that she had not done it sooner. The poker was still warm in her hand when the footman found her. He stood in the doorway, young, pale, his silver tray listing to one side as though the sight had knocked the sense from his body, and he looked from Agnes to the man on the floor and back again, the way a person does when their mind simply refuses the information their eyes are sending. Agnes did not lower the poker. She was not, in that moment, afraid. That would come later in the dark in the narrow bed of her room on the upper floor, when her hands would not stop trembling and the sound of the Duchess's breath, those awful ragged pulls of air, would replay behind her eyes until dawn. But right now, standing over Cornelius Vane with her cap gone crooked and a smear of ash across her wrist, Agnes Holt felt something she had no precise name for. It was not pride. It was not satisfaction. It was the particular stillness that comes when a woman has spent 12 years being very, very careful, and has at last decided to stop. Cornelius Vane lay on the drawing-room rug, one arm flung out, his fashionable coat pulled around him. He was breathing. She had checked. She was not so far gone as to be indifferent on that point. But there was blood at his temple, and his cravat had twisted around in the fall, and he looked, for perhaps the first time in his 34 years of living, entirely helpless. Good Agnes thought. And immediately hated herself for thinking it. She had come to Ashmore Hall at 17, 2 weeks after her mother died, and left her with nothing but a letter of recommendation written in a hand Agnes had never seen before. The letter was addressed to the Dowager Duchess of Ashmore, a woman Agnes knew only by reputation, which in those days was a complicated thing. Formidable, people said. Particular. The kind of particular that made housemaids cry. Agnes had not cried. She was 17 and had already decided that crying was something she could not afford. The Duchess, Isadora Vane, née Calder, twice widowed, once remarked upon in 3 newspapers for reasons that were never made entirely clear, had received her in a sitting room that smelled of dried roses and old paper. She had looked Agnes over for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then she had said without warmth and without cruelty, "You have steady hands." Agnes had not known what to say to that. She had simply held them out, palms up, and let the Duchess look. "You will do," Isadora said. And that was the whole of it. 12 years. Agnes had learned the hall the way she had learned everything. Methodically, quietly, by watching and listening and never asking more than was required. She knew which floorboards groaned. She knew that the Duchess took her tea too strong and her laudanum not at all, despite what Dr. Fenwick kept prescribing. She knew the portrait in the East Corridor, a young woman with honey-colored hair and an expression caught halfway between defiance and grief, made the Duchess stop every time she passed it, and that the Duchess always pretended otherwise. She knew about the bruises. The Duchess wore gloves always. Long ones even in the house. Agnes had been the one to help her dress for 7 of those 12 years, and she had seen the yellowing at the wrists, the older marks faded to green. She had never said anything. The Duchess had never offered anything. It was one of the many silences between them that had grown so solid it felt almost structural, like a wall you simply routed yourself around. Cornelius Vane had arrived in October. He had come with a solicitor and a trunk and a letter from a barrister in the city whose name Agnes did not recognize, and he had installed himself in the West Wing as though the question of whether he was welcome had simply never occurred to him. He was the Duchess's nephew by her first marriage. The dissolute connection, the one Isadora referred to when she referred to him at all as that particular difficulty. He was handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, expensively and with full knowledge of it. His smile arrived slightly before the rest of him, and it had a way of staying too long. He wanted the estate. He had made no great secret of it. There were papers, he said. Irregularities in the original settlement. His solicitor had opinions. All of it delivered with that smile over port, while Isadora sat at the head of her own table and said nothing, and Agnes poured and watched and said nothing either. But the nights were different. Agnes had heard it first 3 weeks in, a sound she could not immediately place. A closing door too firm. Footsteps in the corridor outside the Duchess's rooms starting again. She had told herself it was nothing. The house was old. The house had its own moods. She had gone back to sleep. She did not go back to sleep the second time. Or the third. On the fourth night she took the fireplace poker from her own room. A small, ugly thing heavier than it looked, and she sat in the chair by her door with it across her knees and she waited. She had not expected to use it so soon. She had heard the sound at 11:30. Not footsteps this time, something worse. A thud, and then the Duchess's voice, cut short in a way that voices are not naturally cut short. Agnes was already moving before she had finished thinking, already at the drawing-room door before she had finished deciding, and when she pushed it open what she saw arranged itself in her mind with terrible, unhurried clarity. Cornelius Vane. The Duchess. His hands. His hands were around Isadora's throat. The Duchess's face was a color Agnes had no name for. Her heels were not quite touching the floor. Her gloved fingers had gone up and were pulling at his wrists with a force that was already becoming less than it had been, and her eyes, those controlled steel-gray eyes that had never once shown Agnes anything she was not meant to see. Those eyes were wide in a way that Agnes had never seen and would never, in all her remaining years, forget. He did not think. She was not sure afterwards that there was time for thought. There was only the poker in her hand and the arc of it through the air and the sound it made, a sound she would also not forget, but which she would not describe, not to anyone, not ever, and then Cornelius Vane was on the floor. The Duchess did not fall. She caught the edge of the mantelpiece and she held it and she breathed. Those ragged pulling breaths. Her free hand went to her throat. Her eyes found Agnes. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Agnes, the Duchess said at last. Her voice was a ruin. Put that down. Agnes looked at the poker. Then she looked at Cornelius Vane. Then slowly she shook her head. Not yet, Your Grace, she said. And so the footman had found her like that, standing guard over a crumpled lord, the poker still warm, her cap crooked, her face completely calm. The house around them was beginning to stir. Somewhere a bell was being rung. Somewhere in the morning, a magistrate would be sent for. Agnes thought about that. About what it would mean. About the law and what the law had ever done for women who stood in rooms like this one holding things like this over men like him. He kept standing. She could do that much at least. She had always been good at standing still. Millbank prisons smelled of river water and slow despair, and Lord Edmund Farrow had never once gotten used to it. He had been inside its walls perhaps 40 times over the course of his career, first as a barrister, then as the kind of magistrate who still insisted on seeing the accused in person before forming an opinion, a habit his colleagues found eccentric and his superiors found mildly irritating. He did not care what they found it. He came anyway. He was not a large man, which sometimes surprised people who had only read his name on documents. Edmund Farrow on paper had a certain weight to him. Decisions handed down, arguments constructed with a precision that left very little room for rebuttal. In person he was lean and rather quiet, with dark eyes that moved more than the rest of him did, and the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself a long time ago to think before he spoke. He was 38. He had never married, which London found baffling and which Edmund found irrelevant. He had been given the Ashmore case on a Wednesday morning by a senior magistrate who had looked at him across a desk piled with paper and said, with the cheerful indifference of a man assigning someone else's problem, "Delicate business. Lord's nephew, woman's servant, assault. Press is already sniffing. Handle it quietly." Edmund had looked at the file. He had read it twice on the cab ride over. He had read it a third time, sitting in the warden's anteroom while the gas lamp above him hissed faintly, and the third reading had not made him feel any more settled than the first two. The charge was assault occasioning grievous bodily harm. The accused was one Agnes Holt, lady's maid, aged 29, no prior record, no family listed. The complainant was Cornelius Vane, nephew to the Dowager Duchess of Ashmore, who was currently recovering from a depressed fracture of the temporal bone at his physician's address in Marylebone and had declined so far to be interviewed. The Duchess herself had not been charged with anything, but her statement, 3 lines written in a hand so controlled it looked nearly printed, said only that she had witnessed nothing of consequence and could not speak to the events of the evening. Edmund had read those 3 lines 5 times. They were the most carefully constructed nothing he had encountered in 15 years of legal practice. He folded the file. He followed the warden's boy down a corridor that grew colder with each turn, and he told himself, as he always did, to form no impression before he had spoken to the woman himself. The visiting room was a narrow thing, stone floor, stone walls, a single window set too high to see from, a table bolted to the ground, and across the middle of it a bar of iron, not quite waist height, that divided the space into 2 nearly identical halves. There was a chair on each side. On one sat Edmund. On the other, after a wait of 4 minutes that he counted without meaning to, sat Agnes Holt. He had expected, he was not certain what he had expected. Something easier to categorize, perhaps. Women who ended up in rooms like this one usually arrived with some visible explanation. Grief or fury or the particular blankness of someone who had already decided nothing mattered anymore. Agnes Holt arrived with none of these. She arrived the way she had apparently stood over Cornelius Vane, quietly, and with her chin at an angle that made the word defiance seem slightly too theatrical. She sat. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him. Her face was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was too angular, too direct, the sort of face that made you feel assessed rather than observed. Her hair was dark and very neatly arranged, which struck him as a remarkable feat given the circumstances. Her dress was the plain gray of the prison issue, but she wore it as though she had chosen it herself. Her eyes were the particular color of deep water, not quite green, not quite brown, and they settled on him with a steadiness that he felt faintly in his chest. "Lord Pharaoh," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried. Not the voice he had expected from a lady's maid, though he supposed that was his own prejudice showing itself. "Miss Holt." He opened his folder more for something to do with his hands than because he needed to consult it. "I am the magistrate assigned to determine whether this matter proceeds to trial. I would like to ask you some questions if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. "Though I suspect you have already read everything." "I have read the statements, yes." "Then you know what I did." "I know what is alleged," he said carefully. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. "You are very precise," she said. "It is a professional obligation." "Is it?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said without inflection, he had his hands around her throat. He had lifted her, her feet were not on the floor. "She is 63 years old and she weighs 7 stone and he had her off the floor by her throat." Pause. "I hit him. I would do it again." Edmund wrote nothing. He kept his eyes on her. "You understand," he said, "that this statement does not constitute a defense under current law." "I understand exactly what it constitutes," Agnes said. "I understand that the law does not recognize what I did as protection. I understand that a servant striking a gentleman is assault regardless of the reason, and that a woman's word about what preceded it is worth rather less than the gentleman's word about the headache it caused him." She said all of this without bitterness, which was almost worse than if she had said it with fury. It was simply the way she had arranged the facts. "I am not asking you to call it lawful. I am telling you what happened." Edmund looked at his file for longer than he needed to. He had a habit, one he would not have named aloud to anyone, of listening not to what people said but to what their saying cost them. Most witnesses arrived with either too much or too little to spend. They performed outrage or they collapsed inward. Agnes Holt spent nothing at all. She said what she knew with the economy of someone who had been saving it for a long time and was now simply delivering it. And the restraint of it was so complete that he found himself believing her before he had consciously decided to. That was, he thought, a problem. "Tell me about the Duchess," he said. A very slight pause. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you think I should." Agnes looked at her hands. They were folded one over the other on the table's edge, gloved, plain cotton, slightly worn at the right thumb, and she studied them for a moment as though reading something there. "She is the most intelligent person I have ever been in a room with," she said at last. And one of the loneliest. And she would be furious to hear me say either of those things, so I am saying them to you because I need you to understand that what she wrote in that statement, the nothing she wrote, was not indifference. She is protecting herself in the only way she knows how. She has been doing it for decades. Protecting herself from what? Agnes raised her eyes. From exactly what happened to her 3 nights ago, she said. Except that this time I was there. The room was very quiet. Somewhere far off, a door closed heavily, and the sound moved through the stone like a slow shudder. Edmund became aware, in the way that one becomes aware of things one would rather not, that he had stopped taking notes some time ago. He became aware also that he had leaned forward, not much, barely inches, and that she had not moved at all, and that the iron bar between them was approximately the width of a forearm, and that the room felt suddenly rather smaller than its dimensions suggested. He sat back. He looked at his file. "Miss Holt," he said, "I cannot exonerate you on the basis of what you have told me. I want to be clear about that. What I can do is investigate further before this goes to a judge. But I will need access to the hall, and I will need the Duchess to speak to me directly." "She won't," Agnes said. Flat. "Certain." "Why not?" Agnes looked at him for a long moment. He had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, not unkindly but thoroughly, the way one reads a document one is not sure whether to trust. "Because she has never asked anyone for help in her life," Agnes said. "And she does not intend to begin with a man who works for the same system that has been ignoring her for 30 years. A beat. No offense, Lord Pharaoh. Some taken," he said before he could think better of it. This time the thing that moved across her face was unmistakably a smile. Small. Very brief. Gone almost before it arrived. But it changed something in her face, softened the angles, let something through that the stillness had been keeping back, and Edmund found, to his considerable annoyance, that he wanted to see it again. He closed his file. "I will return on Friday," he said. "If you think of anything else." "I think of very little else," Agnes said quietly. Not to him exactly. To herself or to the room. She was looking at the iron bar between them, and there was something in her expression that had nothing to do with him or with Friday or with the law. Something private and tired and much older than 29, and he did not ask about it. He stood. He gathered his things. He walked to the door and waited for the guard to unlock it, and just before it swung open he heard her voice behind him, still low, still unhurried. "Lord Pharaoh." He turned. "She used to stop at a portrait," Agnes said. "In the east corridor of the hall. Every time. For 12 years I watched her stop at it and pretend she hadn't." She paused. "I think that portrait is relevant. I think you should ask her about it." He did not write it down. He did not need to. "I will," he said. The door closed between them. Edmund stood in the cold corridor and breathed for a moment, which was something he did not ordinarily need to remind himself to do. Then he put his file under his arm and walked back toward the faint gray light of the entrance, and he thought about steady hands and iron bars, and the way a woman's face could change in an instant and make you feel in the pit of your chest that you had just glimpsed something you were not supposed to see. He thought about that rather more than was useful on the cab ride home. Chapter 3. Ashmore Hall in daylight was a different creature from the one Agnes had described. It was large and cold and very clean, in the way that houses are clean when they have been cleaned for generations and it has stopped being effort and become simply the natural order of things. A butler named Prest received Edmund at the door with the expression of a man who had been briefed on this visit and had decided to be cooperative in the most unhelpful way possible, answering every question with a complete sentence that contained nothing. Yes, the Duchess was at home. Yes, she was prepared to receive him. No, he could not speak with the other staff today as it was Thursday, and on Thursdays they had their half-day. Edmund had not asked about Thursdays, but he noted the information. He was shown through the entrance hall, past the great staircase with its gleaming banister, and into a morning room where a fire had been lit with what felt like deliberate adequacy, enough warmth to be civil, not enough to encourage staying. The Duchess of Ashmore was already seated when he arrived, which told him she had positioned herself before his entrance rather than rising to receive him, and that too he filed away. Isadora Vane was a small woman. That was the first thing. Smaller than he had imagined from the weight of her name, smaller perhaps than she had been before 3 nights ago had taken something from her she might not get back. She sat with her spine very straight and her hands in her lap, gloved, and she looked at Edmund with the grey eyes of someone who had outlasted several people who had underestimated her, and intended to outlast several more. "Lord Pharaoh," she said. Her voice was still rough at the edges. "Not much. Enough. Your Grace." He sat where she gestured without being told it was the lesser chair. "I appreciate you receiving me. I am told I had little choice." "You had some," he said. "Less than I would like given the circumstances. But some." She studied him. He had the sense of being passed through some internal mechanism, sorted, weighted, filed. He let her do it. Rushing Isadora Vane would be like rushing a tide. "You have seen Agnes," she said at last. "Not a question." "I have. And she is well," he said carefully. "Considering." Something passed across the Duchess's face, too fast, too private to name. Her gloved hands moved slightly in her lap, then stilled. "She should not be there," she said. The words came out stripped of their usual finish, and he thought that the stripping was not intentional, which meant she was more tired than she wanted him to know. "No," Edmund said. "She should not. Which is why I would like to understand as fully as possible what preceded that evening." He paused. "Your Grace, I have read your statement. Then you know my position. I know what you chose to put in writing. I am asking what you chose to leave out." The fire shifted in the grate. A coal settled. Outside, the November wind moved through the garden with a sound like something being drawn slowly across stone. "My nephew," Isadora said very precisely, "has been contesting the terms of my late husband's estate settlement for 2 years. He believes, incorrectly, that there are grounds. He arrived here in October to, as he put it, discuss the matter directly. What he did instead was make clear that he intended to make my continued residence in this house as uncomfortable as possible until I agreed to his terms." She paused. "I did not agree." "And the night in question?" A long silence. Her eyes moved to the window. The light outside was thin and very white, the particular light of late autumn in London that illuminates without warming. "He came to my room," she said. "I had locked the door. He had apparently obtained a key." Another pause, shorter. "He was not sober. He said certain things. He did what your file tells you he did." Her chin rose by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. "And then Agnes came in. And struck him." "And struck him," the Duchess agreed. Flat. Factual. And beneath the flatness, Edmund heard it. The thing she was not saying, the thing she had perhaps never said aloud in 63 years of being precisely composed, that someone had come for her. That someone had come and had not weighed the cost first. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "Your Grace, I would like to see the East Corridor." She went very still. It was different from her ordinary stillness, which was controlled and deliberate. This was the stillness of someone who has been caught off guard and is deciding very quickly what to do about it. "The East Corridor," she repeated. "There is a portrait there," he said. "I have been told it may be relevant to the investigation." "Told by whom?" He said nothing. He did not need to. The Duchess looked at him for a long time. Then she rose from her chair, slowly, with the care of someone whose body had been through something it was still computing, and she said, "Come then," and walked ahead of him out of the room. The East Corridor was long and dim, its walls hung with portraits in heavy frames that had darkened with age at the corners. The faces in them were arranged in the particular order of family galleries. Oldest at the far end, most recent near the door, a whole lineage flattening into paint. Edmund followed the Duchess and said nothing because she said nothing, and because the corridor felt like the kind of place where speaking too soon would break something. She stopped. It was not the grandest portrait in the gallery. It was not the largest or the most skillfully executed. But it held the eye in the way that things hold the eye when they contain something real. A girl of perhaps 20, seated at an angle, in a dress of pale blue that had been painted with more care than the background. Her hair was dark. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was turned very slightly toward the painter, as though she had just been about to say something, and the painter had caught her in the instant before she decided not to. Her eyes were the particular color of deep water. Not quite green, not quite brown. Edmund looked at the portrait. He looked at it for rather longer than the moment required. Then slowly he looked at the Duchess. Isadora was watching him watch it. Her expression had the quality of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that the carrying has become indistinguishable from the self. She did not look afraid, exactly. She looked like a woman who has finally reached the edge of something she knew she would eventually reach, and is simply standing there taking stock. "Who is she?" he asked, though part of him had already understood, in the way that the mind arrives at conclusions slightly before the words catch up. "Her name was Clara Holt," the Duchess said. "She came to work in this house when she was 17. She was exceptional. Steady. Quiet. She had her mother's eyes. A pause so small it was almost not a pause. My daughter's eyes. My daughter, who I was told had died in childbirth, along with the child in the winter of 1851. The corridor was very quiet. But she had not," Edmund said. "She had not." Isadora's voice did not waver. It was one of the more remarkable things Edmund had witnessed in a professional life full of remarkable things. "My daughter survived. The child survived. My late husband, my first husband, had arranged for them to be removed and placed elsewhere. He considered the child a complication. My daughter had not been married. The father was not." She stopped. Started again. "It was dealt with. As things were dealt with. I was told they were dead, and I believed it, because I had no reason then to know that he would lie to me about something of that magnitude." Her chin was still raised. Her hands were still. "I found out the truth in 1863, 12 years after the fact. And by then my daughter was already gone, genuinely gone, a fever that winter, and the child had been placed with a family named Holt in Bermondsey, and had grown up with their name and no knowledge of any other." Edmund heard himself say very quietly, "She was 17 when she came to this house." "Yes. And you knew." "I knew when she walked through the door," Isadora said. "Those hands. That face. She looked exactly as Clara looked at that age, and I had spent 11 years trying to forget what Clara looked like at that age, and I could not." She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Continued. "I could not tell her. I had no proof that would hold in law, and Cornelius knew or suspected, and if the connection became public he would have used it. An illegitimate grandchild with a claim to the estate, however tenuous, would have given him all the ammunition he needed to challenge the settlement entirely and drag her name through every court in London." She turned to look at the portrait fully. "So I kept her close. I kept her safe. I gave her everything I could give her without giving her the one thing that was actually hers. And I told myself it was for her protection, and perhaps it was, and perhaps it was also." She did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Perhaps it was also that she could not bear to lose her again. Edmund stood in front of the portrait for a long time after the Duchess had excused herself, quietly, without drama, like someone who has said the most important thing they will ever say and now needs to go somewhere and be very alone with it. He stood and he looked at the folded hands in paint, at the dark hair, at the eyes that were not quite green and not quite brown, and he thought about a woman in a prison visiting room who had said without being asked that she would do it again. He thought about what it cost to guard someone your whole life without knowing why the guarding felt so necessary. Without knowing that the someone was guarding you back across every distance in the only way available to her. He thought about what he was going to do with what he now knew. The portrait girl looked back at him, that half-caught expression, that almost word, and gave him nothing useful. He had not expected her to. The useful part he was going to have to work out himself in the small hours, with the file open on his desk and the knowledge sitting in him like a stone he had swallowed and could not now put back. Agnes Holt did not know she was Agnes Vane. Cornelius Vane, whose skull Agnes had cracked with a poker, was her great-uncle. And Edmund, who had been sent here to determine whether the matter proceeded to trial, had just discovered that the woman he could not stop thinking about had more reason to be in that house. More right, more blood claim, more legitimate belonging, than the man who had tried to take it from her grandmother by force. He buttoned his coat. He nodded to Prest, who received the nod with impeccable blankness. He walked out into the November cold and stood on the steps of Ashmore Hall for a moment, the wind off the Thames finding the back of his neck, and he thought, this is the part where a lesser man decides the truth is too inconvenient to pursue. Then he thought, I have never been able to afford that particular convenience. He went to find a cab. He had a great deal of work to do before Friday, and Agnes Holt was sitting in Millbank prison not knowing that the woman she had nearly died to protect was, in the most bone-deep and irreversible sense, her family. He was going to have to be the one to tell her. He was not looking forward to it, and he could not quite explain why the not looking forward to it felt so unlike dread and so much more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous, with your whole chest open to the wind. Chapter 4. He had not slept well on Thursday night. He had not expected to. He had sat at his desk with the file open and a fresh sheet of paper beside it, and he had written and crossed out and written again until the candle burned low and the paper had more crossings out than words remaining, and at some point between 2 and 3 in the morning he had understood that the difficulty was not legal. The legal difficulty was manageable. Difficult, requiring a particular arrangement of existing evidence and a very careful conversation with a senior magistrate he trusted, but manageable. The real difficulty was something else, and it had nothing to do with the law, and he had spent the remaining hours until dawn refusing to name it. He arrived at Millbank at 10:30. He had the same folder. He had asked for the same room. The guard who brought Agnes in this time was a woman, broad-shouldered and indifferent, who locked the door from the outside with a sound like a judgment being delivered. Agnes sat down. She looked at his face and something in her expression shifted, not alarm exactly but attention sharpening the way it does when a person who is very good at reading rooms walks into one that has changed since they left it. You went to the hall, she said. I did. You spoke to her. I did. He set the folder on the table. He did not open it. Miss Holt, before I tell you what I found, I want to ask you something. And I want you to answer honestly, not tactically. Not the way you answer questions from people who have authority over you. He paused. The way you actually answer. She looked at him for a moment. That is a strange request from a magistrate. Yes, he said. It is. Another moment. Then she nodded slightly. In 12 years, he said, did the Duchess ever treat you differently from the other staff? Not better necessarily, differently. As though there was a distinction she maintained but never named. The question landed and sat there. Agnes did not answer immediately, which told him the answer was yes, and she was working out how much of the yes to give him. She checked on me when I was unwell, she said slowly. The other maids, the physician came. For me she came herself. She pretended she had other business on that floor. Pause. She taught me to read French, which is not standard. She said it was because she needed a maid who could translate her correspondence, but I translated perhaps 4 letters in 12 years. Another pause longer. When my room's window latch broke in January, it was fixed the same day. The scullery maid's broken shutter took 3 weeks. She looked at her hands. I told myself she was particular, that it was simply her manner. You told yourself, Edmund said quietly, because you needed an explanation that did not require you to want something you were not certain was real. Agnes went very still. It was not the stillness she wore like armor, that composed, deliberate steadiness he had seen in this room 4 days ago. This was different. This was the stillness of something being touched that had not been touched in a very long time, and she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read except that it cost her something, and he felt the cost of it in the same place he had felt everything else about her, somewhere behind his sternum where professional distance was supposed to live and apparently had not taken up permanent residence. Lord Pharaoh, she said. Her voice was very careful. What did you find? He told her plainly. He had decided on the cab ride over that plainness was the only honest gift he could offer. No softening, no legal circumlocution, no arrangement of the facts into something more digestible than they were. She had spent 12 years in a house where the most important truth was kept from her in the name of protection, and he would not, for however many minutes this conversation lasted, add another layer to that particular architecture. He told her about the portrait. He told her about Clara. He told her about 1851 and the first husband and the word her grandmother had used, complication, with a steadiness in her voice that had told him exactly how much it had cost her to say it calmly. He told her that Isadora Vane had known from the moment Agnes walked through the door of Ashmore Hall, and had said nothing, and had kept her close instead, and had spent 12 years giving her everything that could be given without paper or proof or name. He told her what she was. Agnes did not move while he spoke. She did not look away. She held his gaze with a steadiness that was different from her usual steadiness. It was the steadiness of someone holding themselves together through sheer will, the way you hold a cracked thing gently so it does not give way entirely before you reach somewhere safe to set it down. When he finished, she was quiet for so long that he began to regret the plainness. He began to think he had miscalculated, that there was a reason people softened things, that the reason was not cowardice but a basic human understanding that truth in its uncut form is not always a kindness. Then Agnes said, "The French lessons." Her voice was almost nothing. A thread of sound. "The French lessons," she said again, and he understood she was not speaking to him now. She was somewhere else, in the sitting room of Ashmore Hall at 19 or 20 or whenever it had been, with the Duchess across from her over a grammar book. And something was rearranging itself in her understanding of every year since. She used to correct my pronunciation and then look at me afterward, just for a moment, with this expression I never understood. I thought it was impatience. I thought she was disappointed. She stopped. She wasn't disappointed. "No," Edmund said. "I don't believe she was." Agnes brought one hand up and pressed it flat against the table. Her gloved fingers spread against the wood and she looked at them and breathed slowly, the kind of breathing that is not about air but about staying in the room when the room is trying to tilt. "She could have told me," Agnes said. Not accusation, something more complicated. The voice of someone turning an object over, examining all its sides. "She was afraid," Edmund said. "Of Cornelius. Of what he would do with the knowledge legally. Of, I think, though she did not say this plainly, of what you might feel if she told you. Whether you would leave." Agnes looked up. Her eyes were bright and not in the way that meant she was about to cry. In the way that meant she was about to say something she had never put into words before. "She was afraid I would leave," she said slowly. "And so she said nothing. And I stayed for 12 years. A very small fractured sound that might have been almost a laugh. I stayed because it was the only place that ever felt like, I did not know why it felt that way. I thought it was simply work I was good at." "Perhaps it was both," Edmund said. She looked at him. He looked back. The iron bar was between them as it always was, and he was aware of it in a way he had not been 4 days ago. Not as a legal boundary but as a physical fact he resented, a distance that existed for procedural reasons and felt increasingly like an insult to something that had nothing to do with procedure. "You said," Agnes said carefully after a moment, "that before you told me, there was something you needed to ask." "Yes. You asked it. You got your answer." She tilted her head very slightly. "So now I would like to ask you something." He had not expected this. He was not sure why he had not expected it. She had established quite clearly in their first meeting that she was not a passive participant in any conversation she was technically required to have. "All right," he said. "What does this change?" she said. "For the case. For the charge. If what you are telling me is true and I am her granddaughter, what does it change practically in the eyes of the law?" "It complicates Cornelius Vane's claim to the estate considerably," Edmund said. "If the connection can be established, which will require documentation the Duchess has apparently been quietly accumulating for some years." He had found that detail in a letter Isadora had pressed into his hand as he left, without comment, without asking him to say anything about it. Then his legal standing weakens significantly. It also gives the Duchess's account of his behavior a material motive, which strengthens the case that the assault, your assault on him, was protective and necessary rather than unprovoked. "But," Agnes said. She heard the but before he said it. "But it does not make it lawful," he said. "Not automatically. The law," he stopped. "Started differently. The law is a machine, Miss Holt. It runs on what it can document. What I believe happened in that room and what I believe about the character of the woman who acted in it, those things matter to me enormously and to the law not at all, unless I can find a way to make them matter through the machine. He looked at her steadily. I'm trying to find that way. I want you to know that. Why, she said. Not suspiciously. Genuinely. It was, he thought, the most difficult question she had asked him, and she had asked it the most quietly. Because you acted rightly, he said, and the law should say so. And because... He paused and made a decision he was probably going to think about for a long time afterward. Because I have been a magistrate for 6 years and I have never once sat across from someone in this room and felt the way I feel sitting across from you, and I am not yet certain what to do about that, but I am certain that letting you go to trial without doing everything available to me is not a thing I am capable of. The room was very quiet. Agnes looked at him. He looked at her. The iron bar between them was approximately 18 inches of Victorian procedural propriety, and on her side of it she lifted her right hand from the table slowly, and set it down again on the very edge of the bar. Not gripping, not grasping, just resting, her gloved fingers curled slightly against the iron. He looked at her hand. He looked at the bar. He was aware that the guard was outside and that there was a small square of window set into the door and that everything happening in this room was, technically, observable by anyone who chose to observe it. He reached forward and set his own hand beside hers. Not touching. Not quite. The width of the iron between them and his bare fingers and her gloved ones, and the air between was so small and so charged that he felt it the way you feel weather changing. In the chest, in the throat, in the very specific silence of two people who have arrived at something and are not yet sure what to call it. Lord Pharaoh, she said. Very low. The way she said things when she was not editing them first. Edmund, he said. He had not planned to say it. Something moved through her face. That thing he had seen once before, the thing she could not quite suppress, the thing that changed the angles and let something through. It stayed longer this time. Long enough that he could see it for what it was. Not a smile exactly, but what lives just below a smile, the feeling that precedes it, the moment before the face decides. Edmund, she said. And his own name in her voice did something completely unreasonable to his capacity for clear thought. Do not make me trust you and then be something I have to recover from. He met her eyes. I won't, he said. It was not a legal promise. It was not the kind of promise he could document or argue in front of a judge. It was the only kind that mattered, set in a stone room in Millbank prison with an iron bar between them and November outside the window. And Agnes Holt looked at him for a long moment with those deep-water eyes, and then she nodded, very slightly, and took her hand back from the bar. He took his back too. He straightened. He picked up his folder. Friday next, he said. I will have something more concrete by then. I will be here, she said with a dryness that surprised a short breath of a laugh out of him before he could stop it. And she heard it, and the not-quite smile came back, briefly, warm and private and entirely not for the room. He left before he did something that could not be undone. He walked back through the cold corridors with his folder under his arm and the feeling of a woman's gloved hand resting near his sitting in his chest like something he would carry for a long time, and he thought about machines, and what they could be made to say when someone who understood them well enough put their mind to it. He thought he understood this one well enough. He intended to find out. Chapter 5. Cornelius Vane withdrew his complaint on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Agnes had cracked his skull open with a fireplace poker. He did it through his solicitor, in writing, in language so carefully neutral that it might have been a letter about the weather. No explanation was offered. None was required. Edmund read the withdrawal notice in his office at 8 in the morning with a cup of tea going cold beside him, and he sat with it for a long time before he allowed himself to feel anything about it. He had spent those 11 days carefully. He had spoken to the senior magistrate, a man named Greaves, dry and exacting and beneath all of that not entirely without conscience. He had laid out the documentation the Duchess had pressed into his hand. Letters, a baptismal record from 1851 that someone had clearly tried to suppress and failed to destroy completely, a notation in a solicitor's ledger that should not have existed but did. He had constructed the argument not emotionally but architecturally, the way he built all his best arguments, one stone at a time, each one tested before the next was placed, until the structure was solid enough that dismantling it would cost more than leaving it standing. Greaves had looked at all of it for a very long time. Then he had said, "The nephew's claim to the estate falls apart entirely if this lineage holds." "Yes," Edmund said. "And he knows it." "He does now." Greaves had looked at him over the top of the documentation with the expression of a man who understands exactly what has happened and has decided, for reasons he will not articulate, to find it acceptable. "The withdrawal will come," he said. "Give it a week." He paused. "You handled this quietly." "I was asked to," Edmund said. Greaves picked up his pen. "The woman should be released the same day the withdrawal is filed. I will see to the paperwork." That had been 4 days ago. And now the withdrawal was on Edmund's desk, and somewhere across the city Agnes Holt was being told she was free to go. And he was sitting with his cold tea and the strange, ungainly feeling of having done the right thing and not yet knowing what came next. He had not planned to be at the prison gates. He told himself this several times on the cab ride over, and he almost believed it by the time he arrived, which meant he did not believe it at all. He stood on the pavement across the narrow street with his coat collar turned up against the December cold. It had turned properly cold now, overnight, the way London did, without announcement or apology, and he waited. She came out at 11:30. She was wearing her own clothes again. The dark dress and the plain wool coat slightly too thin for the weather, and she had her hair pinned correctly this time and her cap straight, and she stood on the steps of Millbank for just a moment with her face turned up and her eyes closed, the way a person does when they need to remind themselves that the sky is still there and still the same sky. She opened her eyes and looked across the street and found him immediately, as though she had known precisely where to look. He supposed he was not difficult to spot. He was, he reflected, standing in the middle of a public pavement across from a prison with no particular reason to be there that he could have explained to a colleague without it being complicated. She came down the steps and crossed toward him. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. When she reached him she stopped, a foot of December between them, and looked at him with those deep-water eyes that had been rearranging his capacity for detachment for the better part of 2 weeks. "You didn't have to come," she said. "No," he agreed. She studied him for a moment the way she studied everything, thoroughly, without performance. Then something in her shoulders released very slightly. Not a collapse. The specific easing of a person who has been holding tension in a particular place for a very long time and has just decided carefully to put it down. "How did you do it?" she asked. "The withdrawal." "He doesn't strike me as the kind of man who concedes anything without being made to." "He isn't," Edmund said. "But he is the kind of man who calculates." When the calculation changed, he paused. "Your grandmother had been accumulating documentation for 9 years. She had a baptismal record that proved your mother's birth and your descent. She had letters. She had a solicitor's notation that your grandfather's people missed when they tried to erase the trail." He watched her face as he said it. She had been preparing quietly for the possibility that she might one day need to prove who you are. She simply was not certain you would want her to. Agnes was quiet for a moment. A carriage rolled past on the street behind her, horses loud on the frozen stones, and she waited for it to pass. "She thought I might not want it," Agnes said. "The connection. Being named. She thought you might feel," Edmund paused, choosing carefully, "that it came too late. Or that it was being offered now out of necessity rather than..." "Rather than love," Agnes said. Flat. Not cruel. Just naming the thing. "Yes." She looked past him for a moment at something in the middle distance, in the way that people look when they are not seeing the street at all, but something internal, something being sorted and resorted. Then she said quietly, "She came herself when I was ill. When I was 22 and had the lung fever in February, and everyone thought..." She stopped. "She sat in the chair by the bed for 2 nights. She told Prest she was checking the inventory in the adjoining room. She never said anything. She just sat there. And I thought she was being particular. A short sound, almost nothing. She sat there for 2 nights in February because she could not lose me again. And I did not know. And she could not tell me." Edmund said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be better than the silence she was finding her way through. "She is not easy to love," Agnes said after a moment. And then more quietly, neither am I. We are, apparently, very alike in that way. The best things usually require some work, Edmund said. He had meant it generally. He was not entirely sure by the time it was out that it had arrived generally. Agnes looked at him. The cold had put color in her face along the jaw and the cheekbones, and she was looking at him with an expression he recognized now. He had catalogued it privately, obsessively, across 4 visits and approximately 12 hours of cumulative time spent thinking about a woman he had no professional reason to keep thinking about. It was the expression she wore when she was not editing herself, when she was letting him see what was actually there. I owe you a considerable debt, she said. I am not certain how to repay it. You don't owe me anything, he said. I told you what I did and why I did it. It was not done in expectation of repayment. I know, she said. That is part of the problem. Lord Pharaoh. Edmund, he said. Without planning to. The corner of her mouth moved. Not the small fractured almost smile he had seen in the prison visiting room. Something warmer, more certain, something she was not suppressing this time but allowing, which was, he found, entirely different and significantly more dangerous to his composure. Edmund, she said. I need to go to her. I need to go to the hall and I need to see her. Before I do anything else. Of course, he said immediately. And after, she stopped. She was choosing her words with the particular care she applied to things that mattered. After. I would like to, if you were willing, I would like to have a conversation with you that does not take place across an iron bar. The December cold was very sharp. The street was very loud. Edmund Pharaoh stood on the pavement outside Millbank Prison and felt something open in him, wide and slightly terrifying, the way doors open when they have been shut a long time, not gradually but all at once, the whole weight of it giving way at once and the air rushing in. I am willing, he said. He had borrowed the phrase from her from their very first exchange, and by the way her eyes changed he thought she recognized it. She went to Ashmore Hall that afternoon. Prest received her at the door and for once his impeccable blankness cracked, just slightly, just at the eyes, with something that looked on a man like Prest remarkably like relief. He took her coat without a word and showed her not to the morning room or the sitting room but to the Duchess's private study, which Agnes had entered perhaps 4 times in 12 years, and which smelled of dried roses and old paper as it always had. Isidora was standing at the window when Agnes came in. She did not turn immediately. Agnes wondered for a moment if she was composing herself and then decided it did not matter because Agnes was composing herself also, and perhaps that was all right. Perhaps 2 women who had spent their whole lives being composed at each other could manage, just this once, to be composed together instead of separately. Agnes, the Duchess said. Her voice still had its rough edges from 3 weeks ago, though they were fading. She turned from the window. Agnes looked at her. She looked at the gray eyes, the straight spine, the hands in their long gloves. She looked at the face of the woman who had sat in a chair beside her bed for 2 February nights and never said a word, and she understood in a way she had not understood anything so cleanly in her life, that love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits in a chair in the dark and pretends to be checking the inventory because it cannot think of anything else to do, and because leaving is not a thing it is capable of. Your Grace, Agnes said and then stopped because the word felt for the first time in 12 years entirely wrong. She tried again. I have been told, she stopped again. Not because she did not know what to say. Because there was too much of it and no correct order, and she was her grandmother's granddaughter in more ways than she had known, and the thing they shared most completely was an inability to begin the sentences that mattered most. Isidora crossed the room. She moved slowly, carefully, with the caution of a woman whose body had been through something and had not entirely forgiven her for it, and she stopped in front of Agnes and looked at her for a long moment, and Agnes looked back, and the silence between them was not the silence it had always been, that structural, load-bearing silence, the wall they routed around. This silence was different. This silence was the kind that comes just before something is finally said, full and waiting like a held breath. I should have told you sooner, Isidora said. Her voice was very quiet. I know that. I have known it for some time. She paused. I was afraid. I know, Agnes said. It was not. Isadora stopped. She looked at her gloved hands very briefly and then back up. I kept you close because I could not. She pressed her lips together. Started again from a different angle, the way people do when the direct route is too steep. You look exactly as she looked, Clara, when she was your age. A long pause. I thought I would lose you the same way. That if I named it, if I claimed it, something would take you from me. As things were taken from me. She exhaled. I am aware that this is not rational. No, Agnes said softly. But I think it is human. Isadora looked at her with those grey eyes that had never once in 12 years shown Agnes more than they intended, and for the first time they showed her everything. Not all at once. Just enough. Just the underneath of all that composure, which turned out to be not coldness at all but the specific tenderness of someone who has loved carefully for so long that they have forgotten love is allowed to be careless sometimes. Agnes reached out. It was not elegant. It was not composed. She took both of the Duchess's gloved hands in her own and held them, and the Duchess's hands turned beneath hers and held back, and they stood there in the private study among the dried roses and old paper, and neither of them said anything for a while because neither of them needed to. Outside, London went about its business in the cold December afternoon, entirely indifferent to two women standing in a room at Ashmore Hall, finding each other 12 years late and not a moment too soon. Edmund received a note on the following Thursday. No address at the top. No formal salutation. Just a line in a hand that was neat and angular and entirely characteristic. Friday if you are still willing. The park at 2 o'clock if the weather holds. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He did not need to read it again. He had, in point of fact, already read it 4 times, which was 2 more than were necessary and 2 fewer than he had wanted to. The weather held. She was already there when he arrived, sitting on a bench near the water with her face turned toward the winter sun, the pale cold light of it falling across her jaw, her hair, the dark wool of her coat collar. She looked, he thought, different from every other time he had seen her. Not more relaxed exactly. Agnes Holt was not a woman who relaxed in any conventional sense, but more present. Less of her energy redirected toward holding something back. As though some internal resource that had been spent entirely on guarding had been partially refunded, and she was still working out what to do with the surplus. She moved along the bench when she saw him. He sat. The park was sparse at this hour, a few nurses with perambulators, a pair of elderly gentlemen arguing with great civility about something neither of them would remember by supper. The water beside them was very still and very cold, the December light lying flat across its surface. No iron bar, he said. No iron bar, she agreed. She looked at the water. He looked at the water. They sat for a moment in the easy silence of people who have, it turns out, nothing to prove to each other. She has asked me to stay, Agnes said. Not as her maid. A pause and something private moved through her face. She has not found the word yet. Neither have I. But I am staying. Good, Edmund said. Cornelius will contest it. Not the assault charge. That is gone. But the lineage, the claim. He will find another solicitor and another argument. He will, Edmund said. And he will lose. The documentation is sufficient and the Duchess has a barrister who is. He paused. Motivated. Agnes turned her head and looked at him. He met her gaze. The winter light was very clear between them. No bars, no stone walls, no procedural distance. Just 2 people on a bench in December, close enough that he could see the small crease between her brows when she was thinking, the particular quality of her attention when she had decided to give it fully. You are taking the case, she said. I have withdrawn from the magistracy on the matter, he said. The case is now civil rather than criminal, which resolves the question of professional conflict. Pause. More or less. More or less, she repeated. Her voice had something in it he was learning to listen for, that low, dry undercurrent that was as close as she came to playfulness when she was being careful. And the not less. The not less, he said, is sitting beside you on this bench. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have not done this before. Whatever this is. Neither have I, he said. Not like this. She looked back at the water. He did too. Their shoulders were nearly touching. Not quite, a half-inch of December air between them. The ghost of every bar and boundary the last 3 weeks had placed between them made small and almost laughable out here in the open. She shifted slightly on the bench. Her shoulder came to rest against his, brief and deliberate and entirely understated, the way she did everything that mattered. He did not move away. He felt the contact the way you feel the first warmth of a fire after being cold for a long time. Slowly and then all at once and with the particular gratitude of something that had been missed without being named. I am not easy, she said. Not apology. Just fact offered plainly the way she offered everything she meant. Agnes, he said quietly. She turned her head. Her face was very close. The winter light lay across her cheekbone and the line of her jaw and the dark watercolor of her eyes, and she was looking at him with an expression so unguarded that it nearly stopped his breath. Not the held-back almost smile of the visiting room but the thing behind it, the whole of it, given without reservation for perhaps the first time. He was aware of the nearness of her, of the cold air between them growing warm, of the way her breath and his were making the same small clouds in the December chill. He was aware of her mouth and the slight parting of it, and the way she had gone still in the manner of someone who is waiting to see what the next moment brings without trying to direct it. He could have closed the distance. The distance was nothing. A leaning forward, a moment's decision, the last few inches of everything that had been building since a stone room in Millbank and a woman who had not lowered a fireplace poker. He reached up instead and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face, very gently where the wind had pulled it loose. His fingers barely grazed her cheek. She did not pull back. Her eyes stayed on his and in them he saw it, what she would not say yet, what neither of them was ready to say, but what was there nonetheless, solid and patient and entirely real, waiting to be named when they were ready. I know, he said softly. So am I. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the water and he turned back to the water. And she did not move away from where her shoulder rested against his, and he did not move away either. They sat like that until the light began to change, until the pale winter sun shifted and the shadows lengthened on the path and somewhere a church bell counted out the hour. And when it was time to go, he stood and offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked together through the cold December park without hurry, without declaration, without needing to say anything at all about what they were to each other. Because some things do not need to be announced to be permanent. Behind them, the water lay still and bright in the fading light, holding the reflection of two figures walking away from it, side by side into whatever came next. If this story found you at the right moment, you already know. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are in the world. Subscribe to Charlotte's Title Whispers and never miss what comes next. The next story is already waiting for you.